And hello and welcome to the Unsafe Space. This is episode 6. My name is Keith Redmond. I'm a former Fine Gael councillor and I'm joined by my beloved
Sarah Ryan. I'm also a former councillor, Fianna Fáil variety, better. And welcome to the Unsafe Space. On this episode, we're going to talk about basically the state versus you as a parent. And I'm going to kick off by reminding everybody of a story from a few weeks ago about a kid in the UK who is unnamed, who went blind because of malnutrition because he only ate a certain diet. Now, I think when we actually looked into the story a little bit, I think he had a kind of a condition and an obsessive condition about food. So it wasn't as simple as, he wasn't just some 14-year-old who's just only eating McDonald's.
Fussy eater.
Yeah, but it's an interesting story to kick off a conversation about, you're a libertarian, you believe in minimal state intervention, but where do you draw the line when it comes to people's children? So forget the kid who went blind, because it seems like that's a little bit more complicated than it sounds. But there have been cases, for example, of, parents whose child starved to death because they were raising it as vegan, parents whose child got meningitis, I think it was in Australia, and they tried to treat it with honey and ginseng and some nonsense, and the child died. And I believe that those people should go to prison, and that there is just a great example of people who are, and it happens a lot in modern times, so obsessively consumed with their agenda and their belief system that they can't see the wood from the trees. And even when it comes to their own children. But when should the state intervene? Because I think the state should intervene always when it comes to people's children. But I know what you're going to say. Where do you draw the line? So I think if a child presents sick and the parents are clearly not treating the sickness because of their own beliefs, the state should intervene at that point. And personally, I think that applies to blood transfusions and all kinds of things. What's your take?
Well, you see, there really isn't a kind of a black and white on this. I mean, it's such a minefield and such a grey area. First of all, I suppose we have to talk about what the current situation is. The current situation is that we do have a lot of protections for children. The state does intervene and step in if parents are neglectful. Now, up to the children's rights referendum, it was probably more difficult, in fairness, for the state.
Define neglect is the thing.
Yeah, well, this is it. But also, it was neglect in most people's minds was, outright neglect, not feeding, not clothing, not washing, physically abusing, sexually abusing. We kind of felt we knew what neglect was.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was absolutely undoubtedly true that the state was restricted by the pre-children's rights referendum situation, the status quo that pertained. Where the family unit was considered the primary, source of all wisdom and knowledge, and all that kind of stuff. And it was very hard for the state to intervene in those situations. Children's rights referendum has given children independent rights, independent of parents. It's not an outright abolition of the provision for the family, but there's now a counterbalance for the courts to decide. And at the moment, we have a situation where if a child is brought up, a child's rights are brought up in court that might be contravening what the parents want for the child, say by medical staff in a hospital who think of blood transfusions in the child's interests, or if it's a situation like we have with people who are vehemently, for example, they don't like certain foods given to their child, if they're vegans, if they're, those kind of things. If those situations were brought up, I do believe that the court system now has an ability to step in there. That really unfortunate case of the child recently, the teenager who went blind because he wouldn't eat vegetables and stuff. When I first read that, I thought, oh God, those parents are absolutely appalling. And you do get fussy eaters, but you do have to put your foot down. But then it turns out that kid actually had a condition called ARFID, which is a recognized psychological kind of compulsion where they literally they have an aversion to eating things. He couldn't, I believe, handle the texture of fruits and vegetables and stuff in his mouth, and he would repel them, and they gave him vitamins and he didn't take them, and so it's not as black and white as we first thought. So
not like our son who just won't eat dinner because he had too many cheese drinks.
Yeah, too many cheese drinks. Cheese man. But so anyway, look, to get to the point we're going to discuss today, we're discussing when is it that the state should have the right to step in and take children away from parents, or at least step in and not even take the children away, but mandate that the the parents' wishes are not listened to, and for the child's best interests. And from a libertarian point of view, you would think, well, it's the libertarian believes that the state shouldn't step in, and it's all about what the individual wants. But that's not true, and it comes back to my same conversation I have about nanny statism. Nanny statism is the state stepping in to prevent you as an adult doing something which can harm only you as that adult. This is not that situation. I mean, you have a different individual, a different separate individual, that you are doing something that is harming that individual. So it comes down to, if you saw somebody beating somebody up in the street, the old joke is the libertarian walks by, or you never hire a libertarian lifeguard because he just sees somebody drowning and says, well, you did get in the pool, So that's not true. Libertarians do not believe that. Libertarians are human beings like everybody else, and if somebody's
evidence to the contrary.
If somebody's getting beaten, you step in and you stop them getting beaten. So there's nothing to do with that. So it comes back to this thing where the individual shouldn't be hampered by the state, but it doesn't mean that the individual shouldn't feel the wrath of the wider society if they're doing something harming somebody else. So, but then when do you give the state the authority to step in? So, for example, should the state have the authority to step in and mandate what children learn in school if the parents don't want them learning that in school?
That's exactly the interesting point, is that, I think the state should intervene. I think the state will get to vaccinations in a minute, but I think vaccinations should be compulsory. But I also think I reserve the right, when I read the plan for education of our children, that I will take him out of the school and he won't go in that day.
What day?
The day that they're being taught any concept that we as adults don't fully understand yet. I don't want my son being taught by some teacher I don't want my son being a guinea pig for some new wave agenda for human relationships and whatever. I don't think anybody under the age of 12 needs to be taught anything to do with masturbation or anything like that. I'll do it myself, and I think that the state should just mind their own business, because I just think that when you actually read into at a granular level what's being proposed to be taught to kids, I'm not comfortable with it. I'm their parent. I will decide what they learn on that front. I was taught by my mum, those kind of things, and that's my job as a parent, and I'm not leaving it to some person who's got an agenda to go into the school and teach my son about genders, masturbation, or anything.
Okay, so I mean, there are, I think, lines that most people, this is the point, you see, when you give the state authority to do one thing, does that mean you're giving the state a blank check to do all the other things? And I think no. So when you talk about vaccinations there, I mean, you think that there should be mandatory vaccinations. I absolutely disagree with that, okay? I think, first of all, I was accused on Twitter by a person I have a lot of respect for, actually, Anita, and she's very pro-vaccination, and she felt unhappy with me, putting the podcast out on Gript, because she thought Gript was this organisation that was anti-vax. Gript is a media organisation that puts stories out about lots of different aspects of things, and just for the record, on this podcast, I am pro-vaccination. I'm super pro-vaccination. I think vaccination is scientific and it works. And
we're on our second child getting their vaccinations. Maybe you should go and do them one day.
Yeah, well, I'm working that day. But the point is that, I think that vaccinations are science, they work, and I've absolutely no issue with them. I don't get involved in the conspiracy theory around them. But at the same time, I don't think the state should be mandating people get their child vaccinated. I think the parent makes that decision. But I would say this: if you're the kind of parent who thinks that you don't want your child being vaccinated, you shouldn't then expect that the state is going to allow you to put your child into a state school and potentially be a danger to other children. So if you make that decision, the consequences are you may have to find another school. So I think the state can apply its own value system in a way that doesn't coerce people to have medical treatment that they do not want.
But Keith, this comes back to that thing we talked about in the last podcast, which was about equality of opportunity. And isn't it the absolute center of opportunity that you aren't disadvantaged by your parents being dumb?
Yeah, well, but that, if you brought that to its logical conclusion, that means that if you failed some reading tests when you're 6, you should be taken off your parents and brought to a state school.
No, it's not. It's if your parents are willing, because of their own unscientific stuff that they read on the internet, are going to put you at risk of dying or being, whatever, seriously disadvantaged because of long-term ill health, because of the consequences arising from measles or whatever else, that you are significantly disadvantaged, that your parents have disadvantaged you through their nonsense politics.
Okay, but let's say, for example, and this is often the case. Let's talk. I don't know how we went from vaccinations to circumcisions, but here we go. So in the United States, for example, the vast majority of men are circumcised when they're babies. Okay, and this is allegedly a state health measure. So somebody back in the 30s and 40s come out with this thing where if you circumcise men, they're less likely to get this illness, that illness, these diseases, blah 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 blah. And now it's basically mandated across lots of different states that men are circumcised. Now, personally, I think it's complete bogus science, but it became the common wisdom. And the problem with common wisdoms is that at the moment we think that everybody should be vaccinated, and that's absolutely fine. I think the science is there to vaccinate your child. There are certain people who it is agreed shouldn't be vaccinated. People who have,
autoimmune,
immune system issues and stuff, they shouldn't be vaccinated. So there are certain people who shouldn't be, and that's fine too.
But the herd protects them.
But the herd immunity is really important for those people, because the more people you vaccinate, then the less likely is that they're going to come across somebody with the disease. And so but I think that where you have the state stepping in and mandating a public health measure, which involves injecting somebody with something, that gets that's very, very worrying. I think the state should be accepting and valuing the fact that you shouldn't be forced to have medical treatment that you don't want, and you shouldn't be forcing parents to give their children medical treatment that they don't want if there's no immediate risk to their health. So I think the courts could step in and say your child needs a blood transfusion. You say no, I'm saying yes. The courts should step in and say you're not feeding your children milk, you're giving them soya, and your baby's going to die, which happened recently. That's all fine. But I do draw the line with injecting somebody with vaccines. But I am pro-vaccine.
But you're using examples that are immediate and obvious. But vaccines are at a disadvantage from the emotive story because they're not immediate. Like you don't get a vaccine when you're sick and then the next day you're not sick anymore. That would make it a lot easier. It's a preventative measure. So it's that you don't get the measles. So vaccines working have no good story except my kid just never got sick.
Yeah, one of the arguments against vaccine that I always find really funny is that people will say, why are we vaccinating against diseases that don't exist anymore? And you're like, well,
bring on the dumb.
The reason they don't exist is because we vaccinate everybody.
And now they do again. Measles is now back.
Yeah.
And we have two children. One is 3 and one is 8 months. So the 8 months one is just had, or he's not 8 months, he's 7 months. So he recently had his 6 months injections, and then our 2.5-year-old is up to date, I think, until the year he goes to school.
But that's an interesting point, because if you say that the state should be allowed to mandate children being vaccinated, the state say that the child should be vaccinated at 6 months. Now, you deliberately waited 8 months. Why did you do that?
He's not 8. It wasn't 8 months. It was 7. A little.
It was nearly 8. So why did you do that?
I'm pro-vaccine, right? But I'm also a mother, and I think any mother who's listening to this would agree, and a lot of my friends always say, even you can be completely pro-vaccine, and I am. But when you're sitting in the doctor's office holding your baby, and they take a long time to grow and a long time, they don't come easily, you do have a little bit of doubt. You do think, it's like going on a roller coaster or doing a bungee jump, and you think, is this definitely strapped on properly? And you do have a little moment where you're like, what if? What if they're right? What if my child, is the one who's, it's definitely that. We're all human. Like this, it'd be very difficult to be completely Keith Redmond secure in all of our thoughts and convictions, and just so positive about everything in the world. So, and you don't, because you're at work apparently, but you don't bring our kids to do the vaccines. It's not very nice. They don't like it. The older they get, the more aware they become of the scary lady with the white jacket.
But what if the state said, no, Sarah, we take on board what you're saying, but we decided that it's at 6 months, the day to strike 6 months, that he has to have a vaccine. Just to
explain, right? So I know people are going to message me and say that's so stupid or whatever, but here's what I do. I have read loads about vaccines, whatever, and there is some cases, and you're the man of science, so you can explain this a little bit better than me, where people do have a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 or whatever you can have, even as an adult, you can have an adverse reaction to a vaccine.
Okay. To anything. Yeah. Okay.
So people you know people who've had adverse reactions to flu vaccines and different things like that, where you can have an injury because of it. So I always feel like, just for my own peace of mind or whatever, that waiting a couple of extra weeks, my kids stay at home, they're not in a crash or anything, so it's not like they're being exposed to anything, but I wait a couple of extra weeks until they're that little bit stronger and more robust, because it gives me a little bit of peace of mind when they get the injection that their immune system is just a little bit stronger to be able to take it.
But that goes, you know,
it's just my stupid. Before anybody comes at me, I get it. Like, that's just my own. You know what I mean? Like, placebo, whatever.
Exactly.
If I believe that wearing my pink socks underneath my boots when I go in is a good luck measure to get my kids, you know, whatever, fine, that's my prerogative. And I just always have this thing where I remember when I first brought our first child to get his vaccinations, they were like, they absolutely will not do the first vaccinations until they're at least 4 months on the dot, 6 months on the dot, you know. And I was like, well, why is it on the dot so much? And I felt like maybe it was because, you know, if they're a bit younger, they're a bit more risky. So I just waited the extra couple of weeks. So,
look, I think that it is psychologically reassuring for you to do that, and it's understandable from a parental point of view, but it's completely unscientific.
I know.
And really, if you just magnify that up, the people who are against vaccines of any kind at any stage are just kind of similar thinkers, but they just are a little bit more extreme.
And listen, people, this comes back to like things about like freedom of speech and being respectful of other people's opinions, whatever. And like people who are like anti-vaccination and whatever, I get it. It comes from a good place.
It does.
It comes from a place of absolute love and concern for their children. Nobody's doing it for bad reasons. I get that. And there's so many people in life who come at positions and come at things for bad reasons.
No, I would.
And this is not one of those things.
No, but I would caveat that by saying there are people out there who have definitely hijacked this agenda for their own monetary gain. I mean, you know, you
crystals and homeopaths.
Yeah, absolutely. The homeopaths and the energy healers and all those guys, right? Absolutely, they're all quacks. I'll call them out as quacks, and if any of them are out there and they want to sue me for calling them a quack, you bring your science and I'll bring my science, and let's see how we get on. But
placebo.
Okay, but if you talk about like, for example, the scare story that went out, there was a scare story on steroids that went out about vaccines causing autism. You know, that was brought about by a guy called Professor Wakefield in the UK, who come out with absolute bogus science, who was struck off by the Medical Council in the UK for his bogus science. Yeah. And the damage that he caused, and I would say the deaths that he caused by that, pulling out that bogus science. He is still going around giving talks about how he's been a victim of the dark forces and all this stuff, and he's involved in this movie Vaxxed and all this rubbish, right? Those kind of people do gain, and they're not altruistic. They are not there because
But that's not who I'm talking about.
We're talking about parents.
I'm talking about parents who are frightened, you know, people who, and also, you know, there's so much like psychology caught up in things. Like, lots of people have children who are autistic. Like, it's a safe landing space because some things are hard to understand and they're hard to comprehend. Why my child? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? And if you can put something on it and say it's because of that, then, you know, it makes something make sense that didn't make sense before. And I get that, and I get why people would be frightened. And if there's a documentary out there called Vax, run by Professor Dr. Wakefield or whatever,
he's neither of those things now.
I won't be watching it because it will freak me out. I'm a mother. I'm not impervious to the doubt and the scariness of all of these things. And I think that, like, it is coming from a good place. But, you know, my sister is a doctor. For example, our first son, who's nearly 3, I paid for him to get the chickenpox vaccine because Hannah rang me up. She works in the emergency room. She's a pediatrician. She was like, the chickenpox vaccine is getting worse and worse and worse. It can have long term.
No, chickenpox is getting, not chickenpox vaccine.
Sorry. Chickenpox is getting worse and worse. It can cause X, Y, and Z. It can cause, like, there's children who are getting really, really, like, not just the virus, but then side effects and septicemia and loads of things. So I decided to do that. So I am pro-vaccine. I have compassion and I have understanding for people who are frightened because it comes from a place, not the people who are making money off it, but just mothers. It comes from a place that we all are doing our best as parents, give or take some very small examples. We all want the best for our children, unless we have some weird political agenda that we don't want them to get ahead, etc., etc. But principally, we all want our children to be healthy. We all want our children to be happy. And when somebody starts like insidious rumors and getting into your brain and making you doubt things, that can be really scary. And I understand why people do it. And I'm, as you laugh at me for waiting the extra couple of weeks, but that's a product of all of the things that I've been hearing.
You're a rational person. You're pro-vaccine. You're a rational person, but you still have small doubts that led you to delay the vaccine for a few weeks. And so it just shows how
powerful.
How powerful this narrative has penetrated society. And people who don't have a scientific mind, people who are not particularly educated, if somebody stands up and calls himself Professor this, and I've done studies, and your child is going to get autism if you have it, you kind of go, wow, that guy must know what he's talking about. So this is why it's really...
But it works because it's at people's most vulnerable thing. Like once you have a kid, you will always be vulnerable in a way that you weren't before. Yeah. Like I always say to people, I went traveling, whatever. I had no comprehension of what it must have been like for my parents, and I used to do wild stuff, stupid things. When I think about it now, my friends, crazy, stupid, reckless things. And I used to think, not that I had a death wish or anything, but you'd be kind of like, oh, imagine if I died, it would be terrible. But I had no comprehension of what, because you're dumb and you're young and whatever. And like, once you have a kid, now it's my terror that I die, because God only knows what kind of scrote you'd get with and raise my kids. But also because my children would be raised not by me. And so the rumours about vaccinations, they play on the most one. If there was a rumour out there about a vaccine for me, I wouldn't wait 2 weeks. I wouldn't care. I'd stab myself in the leg and be done with it. But when you're asking me to do something to my kid, it plays on my insecurity. My most vulnerable thing is my children and doing right by my children. That's why it works.
Well, I mean, the latest vaccine and the associated scare story then was about the HPV vaccine, which is being rolled out for kind of 12-year-old girls. It's to protect them against cervical cancer, one of the main causes of cervical cancer. It's now being offered to boys as well, because, as I know from my professional life, HPV can also cause cancer in the mouth, throat, and the rest of it. So boys are obviously equally vulnerable to that. So I always thought boys should be vaccinated. And also it helps with herd immunity, because if the boys are all vaccinated against it, they're not carriers of HPV, and they're not giving it to women who aren't vaccinated. The one girl
who isn't.
Exactly. Right. So, I mean, it made absolute sense. I'm delighted now it's being rolled out. But I was speaking to one of the women I work with, and she was about to have the HPV vaccine given to her daughter, and she was speaking to some woman at the school who said, well, what's this HPV vaccine? Why do we need it? We never had it before. Yeah, we never had it before, and then women died of cervical cancer. And they're well, I was talking to this woman, and she thinks that it's just the government trying to blow. These conspiracy theories that get associated with vaccines always amaze me.
Exactly. We were having this conversation the other day.
How could the government do this? They don't have the confidence to run.
Totally overestimating the competence of the government. Like they're all like, well, we've no hospital and the cervical check and homelessness, but let's go into this room and plan a mass conspiracy that no one will ever find out about, with pharmaceutical companies and all these other people, and burn the minutes and no one will ever know. You're totally overestimating the competence
honestly
of the government.
I know a lot
if only they were that good.
Honestly, I know a lot of ministers, I know a lot of TDs, and let me tell you, these guys are not going to sit around and organise jack shit. Fear not.
It's not a conspiracy, because if it was, the buses would run on time.
Yeah. So basically the HPV thing, is just the latest. I mean, we had we had the measles and autism, and now we've got HPV and all this.
But there is a group of people.
There are.
Daughters. Whose because
that's the injury stuff you talk about, and they like this narcolepsy link. But like the point about that is
okay, but you can't dismiss them, because that's somebody's daughter.
No.
In the same way as when you're saying about your friend in work getting talking to some woman at school who's saying, oh well, isn't there this, and we didn't have this and we didn't have that. We did have that. We do have cervical cancer. There's an incredible campaign that's been run over the last couple of years of a couple of young, gorgeous girls who've died because of not having the vaccine. But you can't expect people to count them and just simply dismiss the fact that there are also girls in Ireland right now who did have an adverse reaction to the thing and are negatively impacted as a result.
But at the same time, and I really blame the Vincent Brown show for this one thing. It was during the election
when they did those debates,
and they did the debate, and at every single constituency debate, they were crazy, they were great fun, but every single constituency debate, he and his producers allowed the same anti-HPV vaccine speech to be read out by somebody in the audience every single time.
With no rebuttal.
With no rebuttal. And as a result, there was a collapse in the uptake of HPV vaccines after that. And I sincerely believe that was down to that show. There's been a mass campaign by the Department of Health to turn that around, and it has increased the uptake of HPV again. But it shows how sensitive and susceptible we all are as parents to these kind of information campaigns. Now, to address the issue directly, okay, there are certain people who are sensitive to vaccines and have developed side effects and adverse reactions, absolutely, but it's a very, very small percentage. And if you were to not get the vaccine because you thought that might happen, you have a far, far greater percentage chance of getting cervical cancer. So you're weighing up a tiny little odd versus a very big odd that you're ignoring. And so when it comes to...
But it is the sense that, like, you know, you can't dismiss one. Like, I'm always fascinated by, like, you know, kind of societal... isms or whatever, I don't even know how to describe it, but Jade Goody in the UK, like I remember, like I was a big fan of Big Brother when it first started, and fascinated at how the public would kind of like turn, you know, like a social experiment, like somebody turn against them, whatever. And Jade Goody was like a real example of like the fascinating part of like of culture, and how she was out and whatever, and then she was in this race round. She kind of like tracked along, you know, started at the beginning of you know, reality television, and then was in whatever, and was considered, you know, like kind of sneered at by a lot of people, and she was kind of dumb, and she was this and she was that, and she was, you know, not particularly well educated, and she didn't speak very well, and she was whatever, and then she was racist, and her whole career was ruined or whatever. But the irony of somebody like that, who then died of cervical cancer, and the increase in the vaccination.
At 27 or something, yeah. No,
well, it was pretty young anyway, and left her 2 sons behind. And the irony that like what she did for society in the increase in vaccinations after her death or whatever, that somebody who was, you know, considered to be, you know, so kind of like that's kind of sneered at, and like not particularly did her state a service, like by what happened to her, and how people, you know, increased the vaccination because of her. It was brilliant. And then it's almost like there's these peaks and troughs, and again, like back to the inequality thing, that like you can be lucky or unlucky to be just, you know, due the vaccine at a time in history where either Jade Goody has just died, or, you know, you roll the dice where, like, you know, you're at the age at the wrong time, and you do or don't get the vaccination as a result. Wow. And that's why I think that there is an argument for the state to intervene, because we're too sensitive and emotionally sensitive to all of these different sad stories on both sides, that our kid could just be a victim of the timing of their birth.
Yeah, but I also think that this, in fairness, the state is striking the right balance with that at the moment. They're providing masses of information. They're doing a really good PR campaign on it, and they're offering it for free to children, and they're encouraging people to get it. We really are on the cusp, I think, of eradicating like probably 90% of cervical cancer for the next generation of women. It's an incredible moment. Like it's like it's like when they discovered a vaccination against polio. We're at that moment where we really could see cervical cancer disappearing as a mainstream cancer. I mean, you know, people talk about the cure for cancer. It's
well,
right.
I mean, I'm 36 and
incredible.
We never got it. So I mean, surely like my generation are all still susceptible. Like what was
yours are. The first generation was literally this. So when they're 12-year-olds, you know, a couple of years ago. So I mean, we're going to start seeing the beneficial effects of it probably within 10 years. So like that's really the exciting kind of moment in history that we're at.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even though I'm so in favour of that and pro-vaccine and excited about it, I really don't think the state should be mandating it, though. And so that's the line.
I think it's too emotional, and I think it's too people can just be swayed one way because of Jade Goody, and then swayed the other way because of Vincent Brown debate, and I just think that it's too volatile.
Yeah, well, people could say the same though about LGBT rights, and say the same about, you know, sexuality, and yet you
equating sexuality with
because people will say that that's emotional health, and so the state is effectively vaccinating emotional health against prejudice and discrimination. But what I'm saying is, you feel you have the right to go against the state's wishes there, but not when it comes to vaccination. And this is the slippery slope that I often talk about. Once you give the state the power to do something, they will assume the power to do everything. I mean, there's this famous line that the state that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have. And so it's really important to not give the state too much power over the individual, because there will always be a common good. There will always be common wisdom, and then you become a victim of it.
But you're talking about, when we talk about equality, you're talking about everybody starting off at the same foot. And I think that part of starting off at the same foot is, where possible, having the same physical health as everybody around you. And if your parents, unfortunately have been misled or whatever, and you haven't been vaccinated and you've suffered illness as a result, you're not equal. You've started off as a disadvantage.
Okay, well, that's what we think, folks, on vaccinations and the role of the state versus the role of parents. And we want to hear from you, though. So do contact us on Twitter, the hashtag Unsafe Space. And we hope to see you next week. And this has been Keith Redmond and
Sarah Ryan.
And with the very best wishes, we will talk to you in episode 7.